Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Basil Considine. I'm here from the ACU Online Writing Center, and let's talk about some frequently confused bits of research lingo. We're going to specifically talk about three different classes of experimental designs and how to distinguish them. This can come up in multiple aspects when you are analyzing different studies and comparing their strengths, knowing what one has from these very simple labels, what they have and haven't accounted for. It's very helpful in understanding at a glance what different research studies have and have not done. It's also very helpful when you are considering designing your own research to know what some of the inherent strengths and weaknesses are and to see if that is appropriate for your situation or what you are trying to discover or accomplish. So let's back up first and talk about what is a research methodology. And we could say that generally speaking, this is the overall strategy that's used to answer one or more research questions. But in the specific terminology, if you're being asked to describe your research methodology and assignment, then they're asking for the framework of research methods and techniques that you have chosen to conduct your study or to describe someone else's that's following a certain generally accepted system of labeling where we classify things as certain archetypical designs within the broader headings of qualitative research, quantitative research, and mixed methods research. Basically, qualitative, it deals with things that do not easily reduce to numbers. Quantitative, to things that can be numbered or coded easily, and mixed methods as things that combined quantitative and qualitative research. So within this, an experiment is a scientific procedure, scientific in this case referring to the empirical measurements that we are trying to do, that we are aspiring to attempt to discover something, to test a hypothesis, or demonstrate a known fact. And that could be replicating something that someone else has done on different conditions. Now, contrast an experiment noun with experimental adjective, where we're talking about the characteristics of something being based on untested ideas or techniques and not yet established or finalized. And I do want to impress that here we're talking about it's not yet having been established or finalized with the specific group in the specific time, because there's this whole business of what we call replication studies, where you're looking to see, is this still true? Is it true with this group that's not quite the same? Is it true with an entirely different group? And so many experiments of different sorts are designed to see whether the findings of one study are also applicable in another. Now, let's distinguish now between the three commonly confused research designs that we're talking about today. Pre-experimental, which we'll briefly say is observational research, where we're looking for a potential cause and effect association. Pre-experimental research is usually not designed to drive implementation, but see, hold on, we think there might be something here. Can we get information to suggest that this might be a good avenue to follow further? Quasi-experimental, where we find a variable, sometimes more than one, but generally starting with one variable that can be manipulated by the researcher. So we're changing something. We're not just watching what happens naturally. We are giving people perhaps a drug in a study or giving them a training, as opposed to a true experimental research that also has a variable that can be manipulated, but is putting people into control groups and experimental groups with random assignments. More on that in a little bit. So let's drill down onto the pre-experimental research design. So fundamentally, we're not going to have random assignment. We're not going to have control groups. And it's generally used for initial exploratory studies because it's a whole lot easier to set up a pre-experimental research design because we're not plopping people into groups. We're just looking at a group and saying, okay, what's happening in here? That's usually going to be one. Sometimes in medical studies, they'll be doing a pre-experimental thing where they'll be just looking and saying, oh, these people took this drug, these people took that drug. in which case you might be looking for different correlations there. But often these are run with the comparison being just the baseline of treatment. And so you have limited control because you're only observing, you're not changing things. And so this is often done in educational settings. If you're doing a pilot study to try and determine whether additional resources should be allocated toward this, or maybe a preliminary investigation where it's just not feasible to randomize things, or it's unappetizing and the study participants would not put up with that. Now, there are a number of different examples here. The first one-shot case study is people get something and you see what happens after that. Pre-test, post-test is going to be you give them a test before something, a drug, an intervention, a training perhaps, and then you see what happens when you measure it later. And a static group comparison is you compare a group that has been treated with a non-randomly selected comparison group. So this is often done when, say, a clinic is looking at records and saying, oh, looking backwards, we gave some people this, we gave some people that. How did it turn out differently? And now it's not they're actively choosing during the study, it's looking backwards and saying, well, for whoever got that treatment, whoever took that drug, perhaps who took the generic versus the brand name drug. Now, the strength of this, the reason why it's used, even though it has some significant downsides, is that it's pretty easy to implement and usually doesn't take that much time, and it can be useful to generate a hypothesis that you'll test in a later study. It's, however, a bit hard to determine causal conclusions because we're not actually controlling, and there are lots of stuff that may be manipulating the results that we're not tracking. Let's contrast that with a quasi-experimental research design where we are actively choosing an intervention or treatment, but there isn't a random assignment of people into groups. Now, that non-random assignment is a very important characteristic, one that people frequently confuse. And when you have the comparison groups, we do need those groups, but if those are being assigned non-randomly, for example, you're letting people opt in or the researcher is putting them into the different groups of their own volition, they often end up unevenly sized, which can make it harder to compare the data if there's a significant difference. And although you are changing one variable, you're going to monitoring whether it's effect on another. The variable could be, are you getting the drug? Are you not? Or which drug are you getting, perhaps? And things are also occurring in a natural setting, which does help increase their generalizability. Uh, Now, quasi-experimental, the natural setting, that's not necessarily unique to it, but with the pre-experimental research design, it's actually not always present there because sometimes people just look at what happened in lab conditions or in a controlled trial environment versus people out in the community. Here are a couple examples here. And let's look at some of the, sorry, here, uh, yes. So our examples here, and then our strengths. Well, when sometimes random assignment isn't possible. So if you have, say, a placebo, very rarely do patients say, oh, please, I'd like to participate in the test where I might get a placebo. Oh, I want the drug. And so with this, we have a case where the lack of random assignment is not possible. And it's generally easier to get people to participate if they feel like there's a chance that they might get the thing, or if in the case of pre-experimental design to get access to their data, to get permission to use their data without changing their normal treatment. Now, these aren't unique to a medical context. It just happens that medical examples are very helpful for explaining them. Now, in the case of our weaknesses, we do have some significant ones. where there's a strong potential for selection bias. Oh, this is a highly motivated patient. We'll put them in the treatment group. Well, they might be really good at adherence. They might be working out, say, in addition to their medication for diabetes control and weight loss. And so you can have a higher chance of selection bias and confounding variables compared to a true experimental design. Often your results will be much more meaningful versus your pre-experimental and guiding towards doing that true experimental study. But because of lack of randomization, it's hard for us to make a really strong inference from this. And so the general hierarchy is you'll conduct a pre-experiment, then a quasi-experiment, and then a true experiment. Now, true experiment, we're going to be changing one or more independent variables while trying to control for extraneous variables. One of the ways to control for that is to have a large group size, and you're going to randomly assign participants to both treatment and control. Now, there are some studies where they'll reach a point where they merge and say, okay, well, the treatment seems so good, we're going to put everyone on treatment now, but that's after collecting data to be able to see that the results are very clear. Now, our key characteristics, that random assignment of participants, we must have that control group. We're going to be manipulating the independent variable. We'll be watching that dependent variable to see how that changes. And we're going to try and minimize extraneous variables through assorted means. Now, that does mean that sometimes when you're doing a true experiment, there'll be things that will be done for both the treatment and control groups that are in common. For example, coming into the doctor for regular checkups, adjustments as necessary to their other stuff. But the main thing is that there's one variable that's being very clearly manipulated, one or more. And you generally try and avoid having more than one manipulated at the same time to maximize the clarity of what is driving change. Got lots of strengths. It's a whole lot easier to determine cause and effect relationships between variables. We got a good amount of control over the extraneous things that tends to lead to more reliable results. And we can evenly balance the groups. If you're randomly assigning, so long as you have an even number of people, you should end up with even sized groups. And the results are easier to replicate, or they should be clear in your documentation how to replicate that, which will enhance the reliability and generalizability if your results are confirmed in other contexts. And we have, typically speaking, clearer and more definitive results versus a non-experimental design. Weaknesses. First one is always the cost. It takes time. It usually takes money to manage a study like this because you want a lot of people. You need to have them evenly sorted. You need to do the treatment. There's a lot of overhead associated with that. And so we can say that this is complex, both in the design, the setup, and the execution. You also want to be very careful that you are not causing harm to people. Generally, you would not want to put people with an illness onto a placebo of no treatment. So usually the comparison is going to be against the standard of care, whatever the default recommendation is to do for people and see, oh, is our care better, the same, or worse than that? And so feasibility is a significant matter. Do we have the funds? Do we have the time? Do we have the resources to do that? And also, you do have some concerns still about external validity. You try and minimize that, but just the fact that people are coming into the doctor regularly and being assessed is often a motivating factor or allows for more timely interventions that someone not enrolled in the study, well, one of the problems of our age in the United States is how to get timely primary care. And so while it is very much stronger than these other types of resources, even so, you do not always see the results being generalized to real world conditions because there is so much else to factor in. All right, I hope that this discussion of some standard research designs has been helpful for you. If you have questions, feel free to email us at onlinewritingcenter@acu.edu. to go to my.acu.edu and select the Online Writing Center groups page to schedule an appointment, or head to our website for more information. Thanks for joining us.